Welcome back to the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Last time Samuel had enlisted with the transport service out of Great Britain. Their primary task up to this point was transporting crews and foot soldiers from various fronts and ships back home to Great Britain. Several of these voyages found the ship in harsh weather or with obnoxious and violent passengers on board. The ship has just returned to Great Britain where it delivered passengers, and Samuel had taken a small day trip up to Edinburgh to see the city before returning back to the ship and departing for Tynemouth Bay. We being ready for sea about the middle of June, and after receiving our sealed orders, we landed our female captain and sailed on the 22nd in company with the Fanny and Diligence transports on the same service. Our orders were to be opened when we got to the westward of Scilly. On the 25th, being in mid-channel, at the top of high water, the James brig of Sunderland had anchored to stop the flood, and they having offered to ride us by a tow line, we accepted their civility, and our master went on board the James, where he procured 6 pieces of salt pork, having none laid in for our present expedition, though we had to traverse some thousands of miles on the Atlantic Ocean. The only provisions for our crew, including the master's mess, was salt beef, bread, and peas, and many a breakfast have been made on bread and cold peas pudding during this voyage, as we were generally close pinched in the beef. On the 30th of June, we fell in with a ship from Bordeaux to Waterford with brandy, from whom we procured a hogshead of cognac, our master paying for it by a draft of the ship's owner. On opening our orders, we found our destination to be New York, and our business was the evacuation of that place. Our master obtained a few quarts of split peas about this time from the Fanny, which, with his 6 pieces of pork and some potatoes, were well husbanded for cabin use. One evening, I having heated some peas soup in the dark on deck for the master's supper, and being in attendance when he began to help himself, I was not a little surprised to perceive that he had lifted out of the soup something like a long leaf of cabbage, and knowing we had nothing of this kind on board, I soon discovered that after washing the saucepan at dinner, the cook had put into it the washed potato net, which had escaped my notice in the dark. This oversight procured me some abuse, but I had the satisfaction to receive the soup for myself in consequence of the blunder. The Fanny transport, being a crazy old ship, sprang a leak about the 10th of July, and our master was desired to come on board her, to consult what was to be done, when it was determined that it was not safe for her to prosecute the voyage, and accordingly, on the 15th, she bore away for Great Britain. Having had some rough weather, we had put 2 pigs below in the 'tween decks, one of which, having discovered some oatmeal balls laid to kill the rats, poisoned itself by eating them, and was thrown overboard. The wind blowing in general from the westward, we made but slow progress, the first half of our passage, and this had great influence on our master's temper, as it changed according to circumstances like the wind. We were kept at work during the day in making twice-laid rope, he having purchased a large quantity of junk, etc., at Portsmouth for this purpose. One night, the weather being moderate, about 11 o'clock, I requested one of my shipmates to comb and tie my hair, for which purpose I sat under the bow of the boat. While we were at this work, the master came forward to see what we were about, and being very superstitious, he flew into a great passion, and gave us to understand that it was no wonder we experienced such a foul wind when such trash as me was combing his hair in the night. One day, carrying our top-gallant sails by the wind against a head sea, one of the braces broke, and the yard kept flying to and fro as the vessel plunged and rose in the waves. To remedy this disaster was a most dangerous service, and each person wished to shift it from himself, on which our blustering commander resorted to his usual mode of abuse. This roused my pride, and I immediately undertook the service. When I began to go out to the yard with the brace, he, perceiving the perilous situation I was in, became extremely frightened, and was now more desirous for me to come back than he was before to urge me on. But being determined to persevere, I paid no attention to his bawling and remonstrances, but accomplished the business at the risk of being jerked into the sea at the expense of my life. What a mercy it is that an elect sinner cannot lose his life till he has experienced the grace of effectual calling. In the longitude of 57 degrees west, we spoke the Argo, man of war, bound to England, and found by her, and our own experience afterwards, that at this time we were 10 degrees ahead of the ship in our reckoning, and of course a sad mortification to our master, who I imagine was much better acquainted with the intricacies and setting of the tide in the Swin Channel than with plain traverse and current sailing in the great Atlantic Ocean. We spoke several vessels from time to time, but all their information was discouraging, viz. That we were much further from America than our captain expected. At last, on the 23rd of August, we got soundings in 80 fathoms. On the 26th, we saw Long Island and the high land of Neversink, and on the same day got within Sandy Hook, the diligence having arrived long before us. The 28th, we began hoisting up our beer and provisions for a survey, when the master sent me to the men of war to solicit the attendance of their sailing masters to inspect the provisions. I first went to the Diomede of 44 guns, Commander Affleck, Mr. Nelson, afterwards Lord Nelson, being the first lieutenant and commanding officer on deck. Here I obtained the surveying officer, and then applied to the Belisarius frigate for another. These masters condemned our beer, cheese, oatmeal, etc., which was ordered to be thrown into the river. These orders we began to execute immediately when our master invited the surveyors into the cabin, and as soon as they disappeared we kept the remainder for our own use, being often much troubled with short commons. After putting our ship into proper repair, we were ordered to the Haymarket Wharf. On the 16th, we began to receive on board emigrants or loyalists, furniture, stock, etc., for St. John's River in the Bay of Fundy, Nova Scotia. The 23rd, mustered the Loyalists in number 73. The 24th, we dropped down to Staten Island. The 28th, we received on board 48 soldiers, discharged from the 42nd Highland Regiment of Foot, intended to settle in Nova Scotia. Whilst lying here, some of our crew were encouraged to go on shore and plunder the farms on Staten Island, and they brought on board a large quantity of apples from the Jersey side. On the 30th, we sailed from Sandy Hook to St. John's River. During our passage, the soldiers and emigrants did not agree, the former stealing the goods of the latter. About a fortnight after sailing, having got past the Bay of Fundy, unknown to us, the moon having brightened the horizon a little, we were astonished by seeing land, with a sandy beach close to us. The ship was immediately tacked, all hands running on deck, and through mercy we escaped being immediately wrecked on Cape Sable. The Loyalists had several large dogs with them, which were tied on the forecastle. These animals did not like the seamen coming near them at night, being vicious. They were thrown down the hatchway to the care of their owners, and I believe 1 or 2 were wantonly thrown overboard. On the 17th of October we entered the Bay of Fundy, and on the 18th arrived in St. John's River. On entering this place, we were highly gratified in beholding the numerous huts and houses scattered over the hills and rising grounds near the entrance of the river, all of which, I believe, had been erected since March last, and great numbers of new wigwams, framed and log houses, were continually beginning as the settlers arrived. On going on shore, I found that though the houses appeared pleasantly situated from the ship, all seemed in disorder on a nearer inspection, for want of a good plan at first. It was with the greatest difficulty any man could be found, there being no regular streets or first arrival, and they grew so close that it was difficult to pass between them. It was therefore requisite to fell them, but by carelessly leaving the stumps 6 inches or a foot above ground, a person ran the risk of breaking his leg or cutting his shin in passing through the settlement during the day. At night, few moved from their habitation, as it would be difficult to find it on their return. At the head of the first reach of the river, on a round hill, there appeared an old fortification, built, I suppose, on the British taking possession. The soil appeared poor, being covered with moss, in which the swine delighted to root. We heard on our arrival that the bears had visited the settlement, but were being driven away or killed. At this place the settlers were to have 1 year's provisions and a lot in the town, and at a future period each single man was to obtain 150 acres, and a married man 200 acres of new or unsettled land in this country. As winter was now fast approaching, our loyalists were anxious to land to prepare their habitations as fast as possible. The weather being now very cold and often severe, we therefore landed them with their goods, whenever they requested it. An old pair with 2 daughters, not very robust, wished to be landed one afternoon, and would not be persuaded to wait for the next morning. They were therefore put on shore under a cliff, with their furniture about them for shelter. The day following, I perceived them in the same place, and thought that the tide had visited their abode during the night. I therefore obtained leave to take a lad with me and a rope to their assistance, and we, with great labor, hauled their effects to the top of the cliffs, where we placed them in a circle to shelter the family from the wind. Every shipment of emigrants from New York had a captain and lieutenants appointed from their own body to transact the business of the shipment, etc. Our captain had conversed with the master of the ship concerning the mode of obtaining the land, and as our commander had some inclination to obtain an estate here, the refugee captain agreed to enter him on the settlers' list, if he wished it. I was now applied to by the master to see if I was willing to remain behind and draw his lot of land, as well as 150 acres for myself, while he returned to England for his family. And finding I was not against it, provided he supplied me from the ship with such articles as I wanted, he agreed to leave with me boxes of glass, nails, rum, etc., for sale to supply my wants. 1 year's provisions I could also obtain from government. Whilst our settlement was in agitation, the winter came on suddenly and very severe with sleet and snow, which settled in large masses on our yards and sails, and which fell from time to time in such heavy lumps as made it dangerous to stay on deck. This cooled the courage of our master and made him give up the idea of obtaining an estate in this dreary province. And to tell the truth, I was not sorry. Having occasion to call on our refugee captain, I proceeded to inquire him out. When passing through the extreme part of the buildings, a girl who had come here in our ship called to me and requested I would visit her father in a wicker cottage, where I found him in bed and extremely ill, having got cold, the hovel not being yet thatched to keep out the weather. But having no future opportunity of visiting him, I know not whether he ever recovered, and fear many must have perished from cold before they could protect themselves from the severity of the climate. Many of the first settlers had gone up the river to look for a suitable place to build on. One of these made a large raft with timber, on which he deposited his family and property, and committed himself to the stream, and on which he was floating out of the river one evening, when we providentially discovered him, and I went in company with 2 or 3 boats' crews to his assistance, and towed the raft to shore. Our carpenter was sent with another man to cut wood towards the settlement of the discharged soldiers, who were not permitted to mix with the refugees. One afternoon I was ordered into the boat to fetch the wood cut, our master being also with us. On our way we passed a deep-laden boat with barrels of flour, conducted by 2 soldiers, one of which was very drunk. Our master, on seeing their danger, advised them to be careful that they might not swamp the boat, but this advice they disregarded, and laughed at his supposed folly. We therefore passed on to the shipping place of our wood. We had not been there long before a person informed us that a boat had sunk, when we discovered it was the boat we had been fearful about, and on looking saw one of the soldiers at a distance swimming. Our master said it was no matter, as they were saucy, and was disinclined to render assistance, but at last we prevailed on him to let us go. We pulled away towards them with the greatest alacrity. The first we approached was swimming on an oar, and seeing he was in a good way, we passed him with words of comfort, exhorting him to keep up his spirits till we picked up his comrade, who was hanging by the boat. This being effected, we took up the swimmer also, who informed us he was not much obliged for our kindness, as we had given his partner the preference. We therefore proceeded to land them, when they informed us that it was useless to save their lives, unless we also picked up their boat and flour. Captain A replied that as they had been saucy, he would do no more unless they paid for our trouble. This they agreed to, on which we picked up the flour and towed the boat on shore. Payment was demanded, but they endeavored to shuffle it off, saying they had little or no money. But on finding our master disposed to seize a barrel of flour for our trouble, a guinea was produced, which our captain took care of, and we returned to load the boat with firewood, which was birch. I had often heard of a wild goose chase, and had now an opportunity of realizing it. One evening, after dark, a tufted goose of the wild breed got loose and flew into the river from our ship. We were immediately sent to search for it, which was difficult employ, the tufts of froth from the falls being very numerous, and many of them appeared like the goose. A person on board made a goose squall, which the one in the water answered, and this directed our search. We frequently got close to it, when it dived and escaped. But at last, after a long and unpleasant chase, and drifting away on the ebb, we seized our prey and had a good tug at the oars to regain our vessel. While we lay here, a seaman of ours, on going on board the Bridgewater, a large transport, caught the smallpox. He was a handsome young man, and had them very numerous, which disfigured him so much, and changed his fresh-colored complexion to a dirty yellow, that no person could say it was the same man. We had no advice for him, and he was very averse to being governed in his diet. We endeavored to keep him from salted provisions, but he would watch for an opportunity and get out of his hammock to carry off the meat when the way was clear. And notwithstanding this, as his time was in the Lord's hands, he recovered. 2 of the transport's boats, having been up the river one day, discovered a large mouse deer in the water, which was wounded and pursued by hunters. But the boats overtook it and brought it to the ship as their prize. I saw part of it, viz., the antlers and a foot, from which I judged it must have been a large animal. I think the extremes of each horn must have been from 3 to 4 feet apart. Here our master wished to spend some time to avoid another expedition from New York, but the agent for transports drove us from our nest, and we got ready for sea. A widow woman, loyalist, and her daughter took their passage with us, being alarmed at the dreary appearance of the country. I was informed that the tide rose to 60 feet at the head of the Bay of Fundy. What an astonishing height! The day we sailed we had a fair wind, and at night it blew very strong while we scudded under low sail. It was my turn to go below from 8 to 12 at night, but the master requiring my attendance till about 9, my watchmates were in bed when I got into the steerage. Here I perceived a great quantity of smoke, which increased and smelt very disagreeable as I approached my hammock. The second mate's hammock being in the same corner with mine, I asked him what he thought of the smoke, which now proceeded from the bulkhead that was at the foot of the mate's cabin. I therefore returned to the captain and informed him of our fears, and on opening the mate's cabin, found it in the most alarming state. This man was in the habit of sticking his candle against his rum case of bottles, and having forgotten that he had left his light in his cabin, did not return to it, but remained on his watch. As the door opened with me, the fire began to glow, the wind being strong on deck. I called loudly, and water was immediately handed down in buckets, and we well drenched the fiddler's cabin, putting out the fire. His rum case was burnt on one side, and part of his feather-bed. When we were near the shoals of Nantucket, we experienced a most tremendous gale of wind, and fearing the sea would drive in the cabin windows, I was ordered to fix in the deadlights or window shutters, but on going into the storeroom, and not finding them as I expected, I questioned the cabin boy about them. The poor woman, being much frightened with the storm, was now further alarmed at the sound of deadlights, and as I was about chastising the boy for being saucy, she entreated me that I would not fight while we were in such danger. However, having found deadlights, I fixed them in their places, and the old lady became more reconciled. Now she understood their meaning. About the 3rd week in November, 1783, we arrived at New York, and found the evacuation nearly completed, which gave our master great hopes of returning to Great Britain. We were now ordered to lie off Staten Island, and to prepare for sea by filling our water, etc. It being my lot to follow this business in cold, frosty weather, dipping the water out of a small well, without any shelter and lightly clothed, my feet and hands suffered severely. We had also to be exposed on the masts and yards in cold, frosty winds, with hail, sleet, etc., which often benumbed my hands so much as nearly to deprive me of feeling, and was therefore obliged often to hold fast by the bending of my arm to prevent falling in my descent. My head was covered with a blue Highland worsted bonnet, which had no rim to keep the hail from my face, therefore it was fully exposed to all weathers. Whilst our master was regaling himself with thoughts of Sunderland, lo, he was aroused from his trance by receiving orders to proceed to St. Augustine for the evacuation of the province of East Florida. This was like an electric shock to him, and his displeasure, as customary, was experienced in full measure by the crew. Here our master laid in a few slops to sell to us, from which each man was supplied with a pair of red baize trousers, so that, when we were aloft reefing the sails, we appeared like a flock of flamingos, a bird seen on the beach of the Bahama Islands, one of which that I saw was about 4 feet from the extremity of one wing, when spread to the other. The seamen call them flamingos. I hope you enjoyed this episode from the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Please like, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you're listening. Be sure to check out the description for more ways you can support this project and others. And tune in next time for more from the Journal of Samuel Kelly.